So we can move to the second speaker then. Another impressive young scholar, Dani Barki Minkovicius. Is it correct? It is. It sounds like a Latin commentator of the name of Aristotle in medieval. Dani Barki is a PhD student of University of São Paulo in Brazil, the host university, and also he is holding a scholarship of the São Paulo's Research Foundation, FAPES, and he focuses on the history of modern and contemporary philosophy, and more specifically, the philosophy of Bergson and Spinoza and Merleau-Ponty. Before his current work, he was working on the problem of expression of duration, but now he moved and concentrates on the relationship between Bergson and Spinoza. He was active during his studentship, and he was one of the co-founders of and for a while a board member of the graduation journal of philosophy of the Department of Philosophy, São Paulo. And he is also a member of the Phenomenology Study Group of the Department of Philosophy as well. And he joined this Bergson bibliography project as well, and he's responsible of the Brazilian literature. Only Brazilian or Latin American in total, Dani?
No, just Brazilian.
Okay, and now he will be given his talk on Bergson as a reader of Spinoza beyond the ambiguities.
Thank you so much, Professor. Je voudrais remercier aussi tout le monde et principalement les organisateurs, donc professeur Débora Morato, professeur Maria Adriana Capello, Dondorat, Caterina Zanti. Je présenterai en anglais, mais après je volontiers pourrais discuter en anglais ou en français. Aqui. Donc, je commencerai à lire mon texte. C'est sur le rapport entre Bergson et Spinoza. Alors, it is well known Bergson's reading of Spinoza in Creative Evolution and Time and Free Will. The so-called parallelism in the Spinozan system is determinism as a result of a mathematical causality and expressed in geometrical constructions, and lastly, its difficulties in solving the passage from eternity to time, misunderstanding both notions would justify Bergson's presentation of Spinoza's philosophy as an excessive intellectualism, grounded in the negation of duration and the petrifying and unnecessary determined mathematical origin. However, this overall critical position gains a more complex shading once one comes across the conference philosophical intuition, where Spinoza is referred to as a fine example of the intricate relationship between the philosophical intuition and its expression, a relationship that in a way defines philosophy for Bergson, leading us to conclude that now Spinoza is somehow presented as a philosopher par excellence. This more affirmative position of Bergson towards Spinoza is alluded to in philosophical intuition when mentioning the courses Bergson gave to Collège de France, where this stance is then even more explicit, as it is in some correspondence. For instance, the famous response Bergson gave to Brunswick. Consequently, if one compares a greater variety of references, Bergson's reading of Spinoza becomes not only more complex, but also somewhat ambiguous. Along with the strict critical reading, there's a more affirmative reading that nevertheless sometimes oscillates between this positive view and a yet critical position, such as the side already mentioned response to Brunswick, the also famous confession Bergson made to Yankovic, assuming the affinity and at the same time opposition he considered to have to Spinoza's philosophy. However, is it the case to assume that Bergson is definitely and unfortunately ambiguous as a reader of Spinoza, or is there a philosophical meaning for such ambiguity? So the hypothesis I'll try to develop, or to present at least, is to solve the problem of an ambiguity in Bergson's reading of Spinoza by posing correctly the problem. If one assumes a Bergsonian position of what is philosophy and how one must study philosophy, one not only discovers the differerences and relationships between the original intuition of a philosophy and its systematization, but also the precise meaning of such dimensions, and moreover, the proposition of not disregarding the systematization, but rather still going beyond it, towards the profound intuition. If so, regarding specifically Spinoza, when Bergson presents an ambiguous position, criticizing Spinoza's system while praising the highly relevant and singular profundity of his thought, indeed of his original intuition, perhaps this actually shows us a genuine course to unveiling the superficial dimensions as such, and what would be the profound and singular dimension as well, and furthermore, and even radically, the complexity of a true philosophy. Finally, this solving the problem of Bergson's ambiguous reading of Spinoza. Well, Spinoza is present in Bergson's reflection from the beginning all the way to the end, so the references of Bergson to Spinoza multiplies. And for my presentation now, I'll focus myself only in the main developments that stand out in Bergson's published works. So I'll follow basically three movements, that is, in Time and Free Will, Creative Evolution, and Philosophical Intuition, that is the conference that was published. And I'll end, and I hope I'll have time to do so, I'll end with some final and really brief remarks on two of Bergson's courses gave at the end of his professor career in the Collège de France, that is about Spinoza mainly. So to start with, in the third chapter of Time and Free Will, Bergson turns to the problem of freedom, seeking to dissolve it by well posing the fact of freedom, experiencing it immediately, at the same time as criticizing the determinist position. There's no room here for an extended discussion of the chapter as a whole and the methodological procedure unfolded through all Time and Free Will. Let us focus ourselves directly to the moment where, in face of the discussion, Spinoza appears. And this happens in two moments. In the beginning of the chapter, interested with the first type of the determinism analyzed, that is the physical determinism, Bergson describes it in its most recent form, related to mechanical theories and more precisely kinetical theories of the matter, grounded to what will interest more closely Bergson on the law of conservation of energy. For the purposes of the discussion sold in the book, the question raised is of the extension of such determinism to the realms of the psychological life, for what makes the problem directs itself to the neurological dimension of the physical world, and then to the applicability of the law of conservation of energy to the psychological states by means of its relation to the neurological states. In one word, the problem with the determinism in this first type is whether or not there's a strict, rigorous relationship between a cerebral state and a psychological state, that is, if there's a rigorous parallelism between both series of phenomena, and not only a posteriori as the parallelism one finds empirically, for this will not demonstrate the necessity of such determinism, but instead, the parallelism comprehended to the series of phenomena for themselves in their totality. In a more general formulation, this is nothing but the problem of the rigorous correspondence of the state of consciousness and the state of extension, a problem that one can find at least from Descartes on, and as Bergson now effectively affirms, is dealt by some of the greatest thinkers. They do affirm such correspondence. And to exemplify this, Bergson refers finally to Leibniz and Spinoza. For what interests us here now, concerning only Spinoza, this is Bergson's description, quote, Spinoza said that the modes of thought and the modes of extension correspond with, but never influence one another. They only express in two different languages the same eternal truth, end of quote. The Spinozist doctrine thus presents a parallelism described by the radical dualism of two series of modes, independent, strictly independent one of the other, yet related one to the other by means of a correspondence understood in terms of a translation. And this idea of the parallelism as a translation was kept in mind because it will appear later in a more complex form. But for now, it is important to emphasize, aside from this notion referred to as the operation of translation, the, if one might say, original of which there are translations, the eternal truth. In this moment of his argumentation, Bergson does not go further detailing what this eternal truth means, nor even the precise manner by which the different series of modes relate to each other. That is, he does not describe in more detail how the operation of translation would work after all. Yet, all of this is sufficient to affirm that Spinoza's reason to pose the rigorous parallelism are in no way physical, which is not sufficient for Bergson's purpose in this moment of his argumentation, because for now his interest is on the solving of physical determinism, show it implies, even if it does not admit, not physical hypotheses. But let us leave the continuation of this development for elsewhere. In this first reference to Spinoza in the beginning of the chapter 3 of Time and Free Will, if this first reference to Spinoza in the beginning of the third chapter of Time and Free Will grounds us at least in the conclusion that Bergson exposes the existence of a parallelism in the Spinoza philosophy, implying at the same time, on one hand, a dualism between states of consciousness and states of extension, and on the other, the eternal dimension beyond and as a justification for this dualism, the second reference to Spinoza in this book focuses again in this eternal dimension. Still, one might be disappointed, for in the second reference, Bergson once more seems less interested in giving an extended justification and even description of this eternal dimension. Nevertheless, one does contextualize the purpose of the reference and be able to identify the gain this new description offers to the frame already made in the first reference we will discuss. So the second reference, therefore, is found close to the end of chapter 3. Bergson at this moment aims the last argument determinists could have to prove their position, that is, to prove that the events happen in a determined matter. This last argument seeks a more fundamental justification for its position, which explicitly means it is an argument for the existence of phenomena qua phenomena. A phenomenon is subjected to the law of causality. Causality thereby justifies the determinism. The fact depends on and comes from the cause. But what exactly does this mean? What is precisely the notion of cause underlined here? So to answer to these questions, and in doing so, dissolving the last argument of the determinism, Bergson describes the underlying notion of prefiguring or preformation as the veiled form of cause, and then discerns two meanings of preformation. And here as well, we will not go further from our present interests, and for that we'll focus only on the first meaning of preformation, where Spinoza appears again. In fact, Spinoza appears here actually in two occasions. The first implicitly, when introducing the sense of preformation as the mathematical sense of the notion, Bergson offers a Spinozian example of the definition of the circumference without mentioning Spinoza though. However, Spinoza is indeed mentioned right in the sequence, as his metaphysics would be a fine development of such sense of preformation in a way it is by considering Spinoza's metaphysics or Descartes' physics that Bergson can conclude the radical meaning of such sense, that is what underlines this notion of preformation. The mathematical notion of preformation, therefore, signifies causality is understood as a necessary relationship between cause and effect, in a necessity so radically established that it indefinitely comes near the relation of identity. The principle of identity establishes the relation between the present and the present, for this is an identity, which in other words means it does not relate a future to the present, demanding for this necessity to the extended causality, which now is a relation that in fact relates the future effect to the present cause, the somehow reinsertion of a temporal dimension, but artificially produced once the necessity of just the present is assured. This ultimately would be the proposition of Spinoza's metaphysics. So quoting Bergson, Spinoza maintained that the indefinite series of phenomena, which takes for us the form of a succession in time, was equivalent in the absolute to the divine unity. He thus assumes, on the one hand, that the relation of apparent causality between phenomena melted away into a relation of identity in the absolute, and on the other, that the indefinite duration of things was all contained in a single moment, which is eternity. End of quote. In other words, to guarantee the necessity of the relationship, Spinoza justifies duration in eternity, understood as the divine unity, the absolute, and the exact negation of the action within duration. Now, just as Spinoza's parallelism is so grounded in eternity, as is a temporal divine instance, now the whole series of phenomena is so grounded and justified. But as we anticipated, Bergson does not go further, giving a more detailed description of Spinoza's metaphysics, nor at least of this eternity here evoked. Nevertheless, for his purpose, also for the purpose of Bergson, there's no need for going beyond what is presented once the intention was to reach the crucial point of the underlying conception of the negation of duration to the necessity of the mathematical sense of preformation. And for our purposes in this presentation, we can leave for now time and free will. Spinoza's metaphysics in this first book is nothing but an example of a sophisticated determinism organizing a parallelism and an underlying and general foundation of an absolute, divine unity, and eternity understood, after all, as a negation of duration and a fundamental identity. It is left to creative evolution a more detailed description of the characteristics of Spinoza's metaphysics. This description in creative evolution appears throughout the history of philosophy Bergson presents in chapter 4 and aims to justify Spinoza's doctrine, as well as Leibniz, as, quote, the very picture of Platonism and Aristotelism seen through Cartesian mechanism, end of quote. I have no intention of summarizing all of Bergson's development to this point where Spinoza is finally described. And Alessandro's presentation was already brilliant to introduce this, so I allow myself to be quicker here. But still, if I'm allowed to bring up some main conclusions reached by the course of this development in chapter 4 of Creative Evolution, but having strictly in mind the purposes of comprehending what will be said about Spinoza, I will emphasize the following remark. To start, we must remember the cinematographic mechanism of our knowledge by which, for pragmatic reasons, we establish the reality as in model figures put into motion by an artificial movement in general. Originally, thus, we consider the immobility, and this most natural procedure of our intelligence is what is developed by Greek philosophy. The ideas or forms are original, or the immobilities that constitute reality, being the ideas or forms, not abstractions, but things in themselves, concrete things. A concept for Greek philosophers is therefore a concrete thing, and science as a system of concepts is at once aesthetic and prior and independent of human intelligence, in this way being a closed, completed, unified system. However, as reality offers as a fact mobility, the problem to Greek philosophers is to the passage of the immobility to the mobility, which is resolved, as Bergson sustains, by a sui generis concept of causality, where, quote, the affirmation of a reality implies the simultaneous affirmation of all the degrees of reality intermediate between it and nothing, end of quote. The images of the gold piece and the small change on one hand, and the terms of an equation on the other are quite illustrative and allows us to understand the God of Aristotle, the necessity this philosopher has to affirm a first motionless mover. The first motionless mover does not have its necessity because motion needs a beginning, but because, on the contrary, motion has no beginning nor end. The sense of unification of all the realities, the systematization derived from this unity exists has its equivalent in the eternal. At once, Greek philosophy would have an understanding of the reality as static, which leads to the knowledge of its object at determined moments, as unified and as eternal, in such a way that metaphysics and science are strictly related as one domain grounded on the system of concepts. A significant change takes place with the emergence of modern science. Even if the cinematographic mechanism still operates as the profound method to all science, modern science differs from the ancient science insofar as it now brings back everything to laws and not to concepts. If we are allowed to simplify the discussion, modern science is interested primarily in the search of, quote, constant relations between variable magnitudes, end of quote, in such a way that it is interested in quantitative variations at the same time it is interested precisely in place of the variation aspect in one magnitude in specific time. However, the cinematographic mechanism is still in cause, and the interest in determining instances to manipulate them already indicates to us that the time modern science takes into account is by no means a durée, time invention, but timeline that indeed substitutes time invention. Nevertheless, even if genuine time as duration has no space in science, with the precise gesture of considering mobility as effectively constitutive of reality, change will no longer be a mere degradation of the essence, and science itself will call for a complementary domain. In other words, differently from the ancient philosophy, modern science opens the distinction of science and metaphysics and enables a metaphysics that will deal with durée in its essence. But because of the cinematographic mechanism, together with the influence of ancient philosophy and the dominant requirements of our pragmatic existence, and thus of science itself, besides the new metaphysics, the temptation to restart over modern science, the old metaphysical attempt gains strength to the point of succeeding as the direction pursued. So then modern metaphysics neglects once again genuine time, concludes that all is given, and seeks the unification of physics, just as was the intention of ancient metaphysics. By this course, Bergson reaches also here in Creative Evolution the description of modern metaphysics as determinist. Despite the breadth of a new metaphysics, modern philosophers conceive the universe as a system rigorously, that is, mathematically determined, theoretically calculable at any moment considered. And all this now, in creative evolution, is somehow justified by this relation between a modern science and a still persistent ancient conception of metaphysics. Yet, how exactly concerned regarding the fact that it is conceived by a new science, which differences with the ancient science may be described, as we did with Bergson, as a system of laws by opposition to a system of concepts, the unity aimed by the moderns will be a unity of laws. And a unity of concepts, as Greek philosophy assumes them to signify, differs in a very much relevant manner from a unity of laws, especially, at least for our interests here now, with regard to the conception of reality it assumes and the philosophical consequences it has. So, quoting Bergson, when a Plato and Aristotle or a Plotinus meld all the concepts of their science into a single one, in so doing they embrace the whole of the real, for concepts are supposed to represent the things themselves, and to possess at least as much positive content. But a law in general expresses a boundary relation, and physical laws in particular express only quantitative relations between concrete things. So that if a modern philosopher works with the laws of the new science as the Greek philosopher did with the concepts of the ancient science, if he makes all the conclusions of physics suppose omniscience converge on a single point, he neglects what is concrete in the phenomena, the qualities perceived, the perceptions themselves. His synthesis comprises, it seems, only a fraction of reality. End of quote. As Bergson continues, by making abstraction to the quantitative, modern science divides reality in two, separating quantity from quality and reporting one to the body and the other to the soul, defining the body by the geometrical extension and the soul by the consciousness. Ancient philosophers did not have this division. Their concepts meant reality itself, and consequently, the unity aimed by the ancients was indeed of the totality of the reality. Strange situation for the moderns, though. The unity now will be all the part, half of the reality, since the laws concern only the quantitative half of the reality. But instead of restricting the synthesis to only half of the reality, modern philosophers assume the duality to establish between them a parallelism, as one half being the rigorous translation of the other. And here in creative evolution, then he is specific on saying a translation. And thereby, we finally find a justification for the parallelism Bergson reads in Spinoza's philosophy. So Bergson here in creative evolution is then explicit, and the very relation between the attributes and the substance in the Spinoza terminology is described as the relationship of translation, as I anticipated. However, with the same gesture that the parallelism is explained, concentrating on this fundamental identity substance, that is, in God, the original by which the translations refer to and by so somehow derive, a relevant difficulty also becomes now explicit. How precisely does the passage from God to the things from eternity to time occur? Differently from the ancient philosophy, modernity has the radical abstraction of the concrete qualitative reality to the laws and relations of quantity. So that unity, fundamental identity, must realize a comprehension of the world at once in relation, by which things are immensely related, and in abstraction, by which quality and quantity are radically distinct. In one word, the Aristotelian solution provided by Hegel has no more space, as Descartes has definitely eliminated it, abstracting the extension to its geometrical form. So that modernity has to face the problem otherwise, giving up the effective reality of all terms, in such a way that the problem of the passage of eternity to time is dissolved as one dissolves one of the terms of the passage, in this case, time. Time, finally, is a mere illusion in the face of eternity. So I will leave creative evolution for now, because my time is already almost ending. But before leaving it, Bergson's last words concerning Spinoza and creative evolution are very much significant, not only by the insistence on affiliating Spinoza to Aristotle, but also for, without any further explication, directing the description towards the niche of knowledge, as those last words poses the problem in terms now of the inadequate and the adequate. And I will comment this briefly in just a second. And to finally leave for now creative evolution with the elements we must consider when dealing with the reading Bergson has of Spinoza, we must return to the very beginning of the description, and after all, contextualize it. It is a description of the doctrine of Spinoza, its system, or even more precisely, let Bergson say, the skeleton of the doctrine. In other words, differently from time and free will, where Spinoza as a whole was subjected to its parallelism and determinism, now in creative evolution, Bergson cites a complexity that cannot be disregarded. Primarily to his doctrine, there is what actually breathes life to the richness of his soul, rich of inventions, the, quote, intuition that breaks through the system, end of quote. This is, by the way, more present in Spinoza than in Leibniz, already meaning the privileged place assumed by Spinoza. Spinoza, in one word, has a philosophical intuition that in absolute is not resumed in the systematic expression of his philosophy. Creative evolution, however, does not develop this philosophical intuition of Spinoza. This reading then must be followed in the published conference Philosophical Intuition, where Bergson effectively discusses his notion of philosophy as this relation between an intuition profound and singular to each philosopher, and the expression of this intuition in what corresponds to the development of the insufficient regarding the intuition of the doctrine, the conceptual systematization is the attempt of expressing such intuition. Once again, we must be alert to the fact that I will not be able to develop this complex description and focus myself on what I already anticipated in the beginning of my presentation, that Spinoza here in the philosophical intuition is announced as the finest example of this relationship between the profound intuition and the conceptual systematization, for there is nothing more illustrative of this than Spinoza's ethics, here described in philosophical intuition, by the contrast between its form and its matter. So the form of the ethics then is exposed in philosophical intuition, emphasizing its presentation more geometrical, and its concepts derived from the Aristotelian and the Cartesian traditions with its distinctions between substance and attribute, thought and extension. And Spinoza's intuition, if ineffable, nevertheless is here suggested by the following description. Quote, let us say, to become with an approximation, that is the feeling of a coincidence between the act by which our mind knows truth perfectly and the operation by which God engenders it. The idea that the conversion of the Alexandrians, when it becomes complete, is indistinguishable from their procession. That when man sprang from divinity and succeeds in returning to it, he perceives that what he had at first taken to be two opposite movements of coming and going are in fact a single movement. A more experience in this case, undertaking to resolve a logical contradiction and to fuse by an abrupt suppression of time, the movement of coming with that of going. So I will not make interpretation of this passage because it will take the time that I don't have, but I want at least to comment on the three main tendencies one should follow from this description. The first one is that we must notice that Bergson uses terms that are not Spinozian to describe Spinoza's intuition. He refers to it in an Alexandrian terminology. And this could cause strangeness after all. Wouldn't the philosophical intuition be exactly what is irreducible to the superficial dimension of philosophy in which it includes the tradition? But the second tendency is that the intuition is referred to by the issue of knowledge. It is referred explicitly to an act of knowing. And if one has an understanding of the Spinoza, it's easy to identify the type of knowledge here in question. The third gender of knowledge, the adequate knowledge, and intuitive knowledge. And so the third tendency is that this profound notion of intuitive knowledge, by which we know we somehow coincide with God, means at once a moral experience and a temporal experience or reality, which more precisely means an eternal existence. So Bergson himself is really brief in his description of Spinoza and philosophical intuition, but he himself points out where we could proceed to find more relevant information, as Bergson in philosophical intuition affirms that his examples here are taken from his experience as a professor at Collège de France, where he gave courses practicing what he now describes. So one could look to those courses. And now to conclude, I will make two more paragraphs. I will briefly comment on two of these courses because Bergson actually gave three courses at College of France having Spinoza's main subject. The academics of 1910, 1911, of 1911, 1912, 1913, 1914. And although we have knowledge of the content of each of those courses, only the first two have manuscripts to which we can have access nowadays. But as I couldn't still access this material, I will only project the detail of its content, especially by reference to one particular commentator, that is Vespasiano, in his book Joie liberté chez Bergson et Spinoza. So by this work, we can anticipate that the 1910-1911 course has the main focus on Spinoza's intuitive knowledge, starting nevertheless with lectures about Plotinus, seeking a comparison between the Alexandrian philosophy, the modern philosophy, and the Spinoza philosophy, but interested in this comparison with what would arise as the specific and reducible in Spinoza, by which the geometric method and the parallelism appear not as what would be the singular aspect of Spinoza. The singular aspect would be more reserved to the notion in Spinoza meaning, and this is very interesting, of expression, and in the way Spinoza deals with the passage from essence to existence, especially in face of the lack of the Aristotelian Healy and the Plotino emanation, which would make Spinoza solve the problem of this passage of eternity to time by the immanent cause. Finally, the singularity of Spinoza would be found much more in the fifth and last part of the Ethics, where the immanent is understood by man's perspective, effectively realizing the intuitive knowledge and reaching happiness and freedom in its genuine existence. And in the 1911-1912 course would include and continue many aspects of the previous one, also discussing in its first lecture the form of Spinozism as a geometric method. But this form would now be opposed to Spinoza's, as Bergson would say, spiritual mysticism, embracing perhaps the profundity of Spinoza. Once again, the comparison between Spinoza and Plotinus takes place, and both philosophers are discussed by means of what would be essential to both of them, the problem of the relation between essence and existence. And once again, this would mean for Spinoza the discussion of beatitude and freedom, eternity, and immanence. And in short, for Bergson demands the comparison between the first and the last parts of the Ethics, since it is the intuitive knowledge and the intellectual love of God, the proposition of Spinoza, that will most relevantly enlighten Spinoza's mysticism and the profound thought. So many other aspects appears in these courses, but I just wanted to briefly show this general view of this course throughout Bergson's reading of Spinoza that I suggest that should be read in this way, in this particular way that is actually the temporal order of the writings. And by following such direction, we can see that in the beginning, Bergson emphasizes Spinoza's parallelism and fundamental notion of causality as referred to and grounded in a necessary, logical, that is mathematical relation of identity in the absolute, in eternity, which would define the Spinoza philosophy as defined determinism. But this position then is justified and placed in the very Bergsonian history of philosophy, where the Spinoza metaphysics is unveiled as the image of the Greek philosophy shown through the Cartesian mechanism, somehow still developing the cinematographic function of our consciousness, but now in relation to the modern science. And by means of this exposition, the parallelism and fundamental identity that underlines and justifies the parallelism, and therefore the dualism, therefore such parallelism, is at this point grounded, but not only in its existence, but perhaps in a more relevant way in its delimited domain as the skeleton, the frame of something in fact larger, something now profound. And now this profundity in Spinoza is something that if we want to investigate, we must go to philosophical intuition, but we must go in a more relevant manner to the courses Bergson gave. So to conclude, so for all this, we can sum up the development of Bergson's reading of Spinoza throughout the years and writings by saying that it is the deepening of the same questions of the domain of what is described Spinoza's philosophy as a determinism intellectualism, however gaining each time complexity and justification, to the point where it unveils the limits of this domain, at once pointing to what escapes such domain, and even more somehow also clarifies it, not to say what clarifies in an ultimate profound way Spinoza's thought or philosophical intuition. For all this, thus, what could firstly be read as an ambiguous stance oscillating between critical and affirmative positions between a determinist philosophy and a profound positive philosophy, between a complex but rigid conceptual systematization, carriers of an Alexandrian Cartesian tradition, and a singular and profound intuition, between all in all, and as one may say, the Spinozism and Spinoza, all of this actually not only reveals its current, justifying the notion of philosophy for which both aspects are constituted, but also reveals that both aspects are required if one wishes to comprehend the genuine meaning of each one of them, and not both in relation. In one word, if one wishes to comprehend Spinoza in all of its complexity and richness. Now, this is only the beginning of something that must be developed much more, but that's what I would like to present for now, just a frame of a hypothesis in course. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dani Barki. This was a more deeper approach towards Bergson's history of philosophy by focusing on his understanding of a single philosopher, great philosopher. I mean, you try to solve his finding. I mean, he's having some ambiguity in between, like admiring Spinoza with so much, and also trying to criticize some of his views. This in-betweenness made him ambiguous. I think this was actually what I understood was coming from the independent-mindedness of Bergson, because he did not want to follow completely any previous philosopher, but also he was trying to give justice to his contributions and his novelty in history of philosophy. I mean, Spinoza was not following, I mean, previous philosophers too. So we have a short kind of time for questions and discussions. Bruno will ask, but shortly, please, this time, because we want to give chances to others, if we can.
I can be the last one to ask a question. No problem at all. I can be, if there's time for me, I can wait, and then.
If there are some, no, please ask. but afterwards, I ask the others. Please do ask. I mean, if you have anything to add or to criticize or to make comments, remarks. Yes, Bruno, go on.
Okay. I was hearing you poorly, so I don't know if I was able to listen to all your presentation. Maybe I missed something and that you have said, and I'm just like saying it again. But my question is related to the place of Leibniz and Spinoza regarding to Aristotle and how Bergson receives the concept of substance. So you said, if I'm not mistaken, you said that Leibniz has Spinoza has a stronger presence than Leibniz and Bergson philosophy. But I was wondering if through the question of substance, Bergson will be closer to Leibniz than Spinoza, and maybe going back to Aristotle, we can have an answer, because to Aristotle or to Leibniz, the question of being, I mean, the equivocity of being, we can say being through a lot of manners, but ways, but the main is toon. So the chi-toon, the question, what is being, is energeia. It's not ousia or hypokemena, which will be substance. So being is movement. So that will be, especially through Havasson, so that will be Bergson's reading of substance, rather than in a more Spinozian and Spinozistic fashion. So my question would be if this way in which Bergson understands the concept of substance puts him closer to Leibniz than to Spinoza, having in mind the role of Aristotle. That's it. Thank you. I think I was brief. And I
yeah, it is brief now. It is enough. Okay. Okay. Brief
yeah.
answer too, please.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you, Bruno. Okay, being brief, when I said that Bergson seems to privilege more Spinoza than Leibniz, it's what's written in Creative Evolution in the beginning. He says that intuition breaks the system for both those philosophers, but more for Spinoza than for Leibniz. And if we go to the correspondence, we find a lot of statements in this direction, like especially, which is very interesting because especially with the correspondence with Comtesse de Murat, because she attended Bergson's courses about Spinoza from the 1910s on. So it seems they discuss a lot about Spinoza. And he comments, yeah, Spinoza, it's the philosopher that has the most rich intuition, and that makes this contrast between the form and the matter of the ethics so significant and so outstanding. Now, but I think that what interests him in Spinoza, it's less this relation concerning the substance, even because the substance in Spinoza is way different from an Aristotelian meaning of substance. What approximates him is the problem of the passage of essence to existence. That he actually say that as Aristotle tried to solve this by the relation between the accident and the substance with the healing, with the matter, Aristotelian matter. The problem to Spinoza is that he is a person. So we already have Descartes abstracting matter to the geometrical extension. In this way, the problem maintains, and he also does not have the emanation from Plotinus. So the way he will solve this problem, Spinoza solve this problem, is what interests most Bergson, and this will appear more in the end of the fifth ethic, the end of the fifth part of the ethic of Spinoza, that is from proposition 24, 25 on. That is when exactly the intuitive knowledge reappears, because intuitive knowledge appears in the first place in the ethics of Spinoza in the scholium, the second scholium of proposition 14 of the second part of the ethics. But then it will appear again in the end of the ethics as man's perspective of the immanent in such a way, and that is the way that you can solve the problem from the passage of eternity to time in an immanent way. And this seems to be what interests more Bergson, and this is something that you only find in all history of philosophy. You only find in Spinoza, and maybe that's because he has this interest so relevant to Spinoza. It's interesting because the author, that the philosopher that is most present in Bergson, perhaps more than Kant, perhaps more than Spinoza, is Plotinus. Something that we lose if we stay only in the published works. But if we go to the courses, we find out that Plotinus is present in every single one of them. And it's interesting because the problem to Plotinus, it's the same, but the solution given, it's otherwise, it's by the emanation. So if you go to these courses about Spinoza at the end of his career in 1910 forward, the images he brings, because he loves these images, are all Plotinus images. And this gives another perspective to everything, because it shows that the problem is always the same, but the solutions given are different. And the differences in the solution in face of the same problem means a lot, I think, at least for the one who wants to interpret. But
okay.
This will be just a brief answer. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I mean, Bergsonian PhDs, they have so many things in their mind. They want to talk and talk, so there's no enough time for them. I mean, Len, if you didn't raise your hand, I would still ask you to say something. I mean, in this, I mean, relation with Kant, and also this competition between Leibniz and Spinoza. And also your question, please.
Well, I just, well, thank you. First of all, it was a really interesting talk, and Alessandro's as well. It was really great. It's still morning over here. It's a great morning of talks. So, but I just, again, really interesting. I never really thought about Bergson with Spinoza. But what about the emotion side? Because the third kind of knowledge, is about love and joy. And because I was just wondering then whether the two sources had some Spinozistic influence on it, which I had never suspected until hearing your talk. So if you could talk about a little bit about what you think. I mean, your best guess, your educated guess on this connection about joy or love in Bergson and Spinoza. The other question is more about you, and because a lot of things you're just saying, like in your response to Bruno's question, sounded very much like Deleuze's reading of Spinoza in the 1968 book, because there, if you remember in chapter 11, he compares Spinoza to Plotinus, and emanation versus immanence. And but I mean, it sounded very similar, but I was curious about how much influence that book had on your thinking. But thank you again for a great talk. So go ahead, please.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Professor. I'll try to be really brief as well in my answer, but thanks a lot. The first question is actually what is motivating me right now. I want to investigate this more. What I can anticipate is that this is like what Bergson identifies as the finality, the goal of Spinoza's philosophy. This is in the courses because it's there that we can find more detailed information. But he explicitly affirms that the goal of Spinoza is the genuine freedom and beatitude. So this would be a result of intellectual love of God that is different. This factuous aspect is different from the third part of the ethics, where you have the description of all of the sentiments and etc. This what appears in the fifth part of the ethics is what Bergson will say is God humanized in such a way. It's very interesting because you have the experience emerging in Spinoza's intellectualism. Like he say, Spinoza has much more experience that he would admit, that in a strict intellectualism reading of Spinoza would admit. But and it's interesting because if you go to some of Bergson's conferences and articles, they end also with a defense, with a proposition of a philosophy that will reach beyond vivre, joie. So there is this convergence, and of course the two sources where Spinoza actually is referred to one time only, in a very implicit and brief moment, but he's there. Somehow he's there. But all of this is just what I can anticipate as something that I really want to investigate from now on. And to say a word or two also about Deleuze reading. That's why I said that it's very interesting when we go to the courses, especially the first one Bergson gave, 1910 and 11, and we find out that Bergson emphasizes as a very relevant and new notion to Spinoza, the notion of expression, and that expression will solve the passage from eternity to time. This is very interesting because what we knew, at least what common sense knew, was that in regard to the reading of Spinoza, the one that emphasized the notion of expression to Spinoza was Deleuze with his Spinoza le problème de l'expression, because expression is a Leibnizian term. That's interesting. Leibniz uses expression to define the relation between the monads, and not Spinoza. So Deleuze was the first one, we thought, to emphasize this. But then if you go to the courses, you find out that Bergson did this before, and did this relation between the Alexandrian philosophy and Spinoza's philosophy. And it's really unlikely that Deleuze had access to this material, because they are manuscripts really recent, really not published and so on. So that is something also that, that I want to investigate. I mean, what this means, what is this conversion? Is just a coincidence, or is there something that can allow us to understand why both philosophers, because Deleuze is the Bergsonian philosophy of the 20th century, one may say, but he's also the Spinoza philosophy of the 20th century.
Okay.
And when he writes about Spinoza, yeah, okay, thank you.
That's enough. Okay. Is there any final note, or if not, I will give to Adriana for the, I mean, Deborah, do you want to say something?
Je voudrais dire quelque chose en français, Denis.
Oui, oui, d'accord.
Tout simplement dire deux choses. J'ai beaucoup aimé ton projet, ce projet de recherche qui est bien parti, à mon avis. Et je dirais qu'il y a aussi l'idée des mouvements immanents, les mouvements immanents, qui c'est quelque chose qu'on peut regarder chez Spinoza avec l'influence allemande, voilà, de l'idéalisme allemand, et aussi la définition de âme, ou Mensch, spirit, mind, chez Spinoza, qui a beaucoup de convergence avec la description que Bergson nous donne de qu'est-ce que c'est mon présent. Mon présent, c'est la conscience de mon corps. Et l'âme, c'est l'idée de mon corps qui existe en acte pour Spinoza. Donc, il y a beaucoup plus d'influence que peut-être Bergson n'a pas explicité. C'est tout. Et merci beaucoup pour ta belle présentation. Okay.
Merci. 2 présentations dans le temps de 3 présentations. Alors, c'était bien, beaucoup de discussions, beaucoup de questions. Je suis content. Thank you very much for two speakers and also for discussants and participants. I mean, this is the end of the session, and there will be another talk in 45 minutes.